on today's StoryBeat.
I met Joan Rivers, and Joan encouraged me to go to New York. I was not really ready. I did move to New York, and I took my page of jokes that I wrote for Joan, and I went to Rollins and Joffe, the people who promoted Robert Klein and other great people, and there was a guy there named Buddy Mora, looked at my stuff and said, "It's a little premature."
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Gabby Gruen, spent most of his professional life as a writer-producer inside the country's most prominent ad agencies. After 20 years of elevating the brands of some of our most prestigious advertisers, and with the help of a Screenwriting MFA from UCLA, Gabby started writing screenplays. His original scripts found homes inside a major motion picture studio and on assignment for several less prominent purveyors of the cinematic arts. With the recent publication of his first novel, The Uniform, a thriller that takes place during the Holocaust, Gabby has begun his fiction writing career. I've read The Uniform and can tell you it's an intense trip through a nasty piece of World War II as experienced by David Korda, a young doctor and Jewish labor camp prisoner who's become an enslaved road crew worker destined for a death camp until he comes upon the body of a murdered Gestapo officer. David contrives to use the officer's bloodied uniform as a means of escape. I was riveted by this chilling page-turner. If you like great reads, I highly recommend The Uniform to you. Gabby will soon publish his second book, The Ride of a Lifetime, a crime story set on the frozen streets of Detroit. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a great privilege for me to have the author, Gabby Gruen, as my guest on StoryBeat today. Gabby, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind words.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I really, truly enjoyed reading your book. So let's go back in time just a little bit. And by the way, we will talk about your book in a bit.
Okay.
I'm curious where your interest first began in life, in both writing, entertainment, advertising. Where did this all begin for you?
Well, believe it or not, I was a real fan of stand-up comedy.
Okay.
So I grew up in Detroit, and I used to go to Windsor, Ontario, across the river, to see people like Joan Rivers and Pete Barbuti and other pros of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Joan Rivers actually bought a few jokes from me and encouraged me to move to New York. So a little encouragement goes a long way with me.
Well, that's useful for most people to have a little encouragement, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So was writing that came first for you? Did you start out writing?
Yeah, it did.
What did you work on?
I was a graduate student at the time at Wayne State University in Detroit,
Okay.
the Harvard of inner city Detroit. And, you know, I was taking writing classes. And when I did, somebody said, "Hey, there's a person here connected to Motown who needs some writing done. Is anybody interested?" And I raised my hand, and they connected me to a comedian / ventriloquist who was affiliated with Motown.
Okay.
And his name was Willie Tyler.
Oh, yeah.
And I started writing for him.
Willie Tyler and Lester.
Willie Tyler and Lester, yes. And it was really fun. You know, I would occasionally go with him to New York for his appearances on talk shows. That was the beginning of my writing.
So you started writing jokes. That's where you started.
I did. Yeah.
You wouldn't know that from reading The Uniform, although there's actually a really good sense of humor in there too, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That was intentional.
It's clear. It's absolutely clear that you intended it that way. So what age were you when you started working for Willie Tyler? How old were you?
I was in my early 20s.
So you didn't start out as a high school person or even in college as a comedy writer or a writer at all.
No, I didn't.
How interesting. So
Yeah.
what then led you to pursue that life as a professional? Was it by meeting up with Willie Tyler? Was that the beginning of it? Where you decided, yeah, I should do this?
That was the beginning of it. And I told you that I met Joan Rivers,
Hmm.
and Joan encouraged me to go to New York. And it was really, I was not really ready. I did move to New York for a short time, and I took my page of jokes that I wrote for Willie and for Joan, and I went to Rollins and Joffe,
Sure.
the famed management company. The people who promoted Woody Allen
Woody Allen. Yeah.
and Robert Klein and other great people. And I went in there with my page of jokes, and there was a guy there named Buddy Mora who very kindly looked at my stuff and said, "It's a little premature." And he was right.
So you were working at a high level quite early then.
Oh, thank you for saying that. I don't know.
You were already meeting big people at the top of the game.
Yeah, I probably could have stuck it out a little bit and seen where it would lead. But
So did that somehow get you into advertising? How did you get to be in the advertising business?
so I left New York after about a month and a half, went back to Detroit, and there was an advertising agency not far away. I mean, that just seemed like the next logical step for me. And I accidentally spoke to a guy at the what I thought was the most creative agency in Detroit, a place called WB Donor. And the creative director told me to send him a resume and contact him and that sort of thing. But after that, he never answered my phone calls. And I was sort of unsophisticated enough to call every day for a month,
Okay.
after which I wrote him a nasty letter.
All the things you're not supposed to do.
Yeah, I told him he was the consummate asshole
Oh.
the side of 8 Mile Road. And that got him to call me back because I had demonstrated some writing talent with that sentence.
That's sort of like from the original Mary Tyler Moore pilot, you've got spunk. I don't like spunk, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But he then hired you?
yeah.
And were you at that agency for your whole career or did you move around?
No, I was there for a year or less.
I see.
But it was nice because I got to learn the business. I got to learn how to solve a problem professionally, a marketing problem. And there were a lot of really talented people there. I mean, Kathy Geiswhite, Larry Kasdan, a comedian named Tom Sharp.
Wow. They were all at this advertising agency in Detroit at this time?
Yes,
Wow.
yes,
So for people who don't know, Kathy Geiswhite created and wrote Kathy,
yeah,
the comic strip Kathy. Lawrence Kasdan goes on to become a great writer-director, including writing The Empire Strikes Back, among
yes,
other movies, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, among other movies. And Tom Sharp was just a well-known stand-up comic.
yes.
That's pretty awesome. Did you know by working there that this was something that you not only could do, but should do, and this would be a professional move for you for a while? Did you know that at that time?
I thought so. I mean, I wasn't really sure because I didn't really have the tools or the maturity to know whether I could go farther.
So what then told you? When did that happen for you where you thought to yourself, "Yeah, I am good at this. I should do this."
Towards the end of my stint there, one of my radio commercials, won an award. And I had called upon my experience being outrageous in a letter to sort of carry it forward. So at the award show, when they were bringing the award to me, I screamed out, "I need a job." And after that, a number of people from agencies who were present started calling me.
You're just right out there. Most people would shy away from that, but you're right in there.
Yeah, it's true.
Do you think that that's the way that people who want to get ahead in the business should think about setting themselves apart from everyone else by doing things like that?
That was spontaneous for me. So I don't know if I would advise it for other people.
You wouldn't contrive it.
No, unless you were really good at it. Unless you could come up with a really good gambit.
And so how long was it for you to be in the business of advertising prior to your becoming a producer? Was that sort of right away, hand in hand?
So I would say after that job, I got hired by an agency in Columbus, Ohio. So the producing started there. I mean, I was producing radio commercials, which is just a great experience. There's a skill set that voiceover people bring to the art of radio production that is really wonderful. I mean, you just learn all about performance and concept and that sort of thing.
And it's, correct me if I'm wrong, the hardest storytelling there is. You have to do it in 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and you got to get everything in there, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And you have to communicate a world. You have to realize that people can't see what's going on, and you have to suggest things so that people actually feel that they're transported to this crazy world, whatever it is.
And so when you're figuring out a commercial at that time, well, and with that space, that short amount of time,
Yeah.
what is the trick? How do you do that? How do you think it through?
The first thing you got to do is have a concept, have an idea. How am I going to communicate the things that I need to communicate for a client in an interesting way? And the interesting way is the thing that carries the process forward.
And is there a technique or a method that you used in order to find those interesting ways?
No, it was just pretty it was pretty spontaneous. It was just based on what I was thinking of that day.
Are you able to tell us any of the products you advertised? Would we know any of them?
I've done a lot of those. I could tell you, when it came to LA, I mean, it was a more prominent group of companies I worked on. I worked on Nike and Mattel and American Express. When I was in Columbus, Ohio, I did work for a fast food company in Detroit. There was the Detroit News. That was the client for which I got the first award.
So you didn't write for the car companies. They probably would have been out of New York, right?
Well, actually, a few of them were in Detroit, and the thing that distinguished WB Donor from the other ad agencies there was that they didn't have any car clients. They didn't. But when I won that award and I got calls, one of them was Campbell Ewald, which was the Chevy agency, and I think they still may be. Yeah,
Well, that's because you yelled out, "I need a job."
yeah. I need a car.
All right, so let's talk about the remainder of what you've been doing, which is screenwriting and
Yeah,
storytelling and now novel writing. You seem to gravitate, if I'm following it correctly, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that you gravitate toward action stories or thrillers or things that are full of actiony.
yeah.
The uniform is full of action. Where does your passion for those kinds of stories come from?
Good question, because I actually began writing comedies.
Right.
The uniform was really based on my father's experience. It was my father's experience as a labor camp prisoner during the Second World War
Oh, really?
inspired this story.
Wow.
Yeah. So I used to talk to him and to my mother about their experience during the war. And I heard many, many stories. And I knew that my father had been a labor camp prisoner. And one day I had the idea, what if a labor camp prisoner stumbles on the body of a murdered Gestapo officer and contrives to use the gashed and bloodied uniform as a means of escape?
Well, that's a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
It is thrilling when you read it because you don't know what's going to happen around every turn, which is exactly what you want in a good story. Are there types of stories that you avoid? Do you avoid writing comedy at this point, or do you still want to write stuff?
Not really, I would. I still love a great comedy.
Where do you find most of your inspirations? Do they just come to you, or do you actually go out and seek them?
I think they just come to me.
You're fortunate that way. The universe is throwing stuff at you.
Yes, yes. I mean, you have to be open to it. I had been writing comedies, I think, before I wrote The Uniform. I wrote other thrillers. Actually, there was a thriller that I wrote based on my mother's wartime experience, and it landed me my first literary agent. It was a Holocaust story as well. And at the time, Holocaust stories were not doing well at the box office. So I just ended up putting that aside.
Well, we've seen at this point literally thousands of World War II books,
Yeah.
and who knows how many hundreds of World War II movies and TV shows.
Yes.
And I was going to ask you why you wanted to do another, but you've already told us the reason. It's because you're inspired by your parents.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, that's a pretty good reason, I think. I'm going to ask you a question I ask lots of guests, and I always am fascinated by the answers. What for you makes a good story good? What makes it work?
Assuming you have a good overall concept, I think the thing that is really critical is the detail, how you burnish a character, how they carry themselves and talk, and what are they facing. I think that the thing that's actually most critical in all of this is the opposition. The greater the opposition, the greater the story.
You're talking about that magic word conflict.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's really all about that. Without
Yeah.
that conflict, you don't really have anything to engage the audience.
In the uniform, the antagonist, the Nazi, is a really difficult opponent. It's a really difficult thing to get around.
You could say that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all of the Nazis, he's surrounded by them.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I mean, David is. Tell the listeners a bit more what the uniform is all about. We've got the general overview, but give us a little more detail of what it's about.
Well, it's really, I had to think about this because I tried to present this to the Jewish Book Council. And they would say, what makes this a Jewish story? And I think it's because everything, all of the little details are an indication of deliverance, that you end up using this to overcome your opponent. For instance, there is an early scene in the story where David is presented by a dying friend with his prayer shawl. And you think it's just going to be, why are you giving me this? And he says, well, you can keep warm with it. But it ends up being a tool for his deliverance.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that's the main theme of the book is deliverance?
No, actually, to me, the main theme is rank.
Rank.
Yeah, because wherever I could in a visual way, I would show a sign of rank. Even one of the earliest paragraphs in the story showed a hand-drawn red cross, which David used to sort of distinguish himself as a medical person.
Mm-hmm. Not only is he a road crew worker, but they also sort of force him to do medical work as well.
Yes, yes.
Which makes him a very fascinating and rich character.
Yeah. He treated his fellow captives that way. The Nazis sort of forced him into that where it came up. There's actually a moment in the story, I don't know if I'm giving away too much, where we actually see him as a flashback in medical school on the day he's thrown out.
You're not giving away too much. That doesn't tell
Okay.
someone that's not rated. It doesn't tell you
Yeah.
anything about
Yeah.
what's happening.
That actually happened to my father.
That actually happened to your father.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how much of the book is from stories that you were told?
A fair amount. I mean, it's really a work of imagination, but there are things that you use from life. For instance, the horse plays a fairly prominent part in the story. And I didn't set out planning to do that, but my mother had a horse, and she used to tell me stories about the horse, about how important
She had a horse in Germany.
it actually was in Hungary, where she came from.
Oh, in Hungary.
Yeah, and it stuck with me, and I didn't know, but, David ends up being confined to a barn, and I thought to myself, "What can I use in the barn?" And having a horse there was pretty helpful.
I think you just said something that's absolutely critical, not only for basic storytelling, but especially for motion picture storytelling, screenwriting.
Yeah.
And that is to be able to take whatever setting you're in and use whatever's there. And you kind of have to figure out either in your mind's eye or through research what's in that space.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think a lot of people don't pay any attention to that. They think, well, I'm just going to tell a story.
Yeah.
But if you start to think about those wonderful things that are around a character,
Yeah.
you can use them.
No question.
So I'm curious, as you were developing the book, what did you spend most of your time on? Was it plot, character, action? What did you think about the most? What did you work on the hardest?
Well, Oh, I need to give you a little bit of a précis.
Sure.
I had originally written this as a screenplay,
Makes sense.
and I couldn't get anybody interested in it.
I understand.
But I
That-
thought it was a good enough story that it was worth developing further.
sure.
So I had the whole story laid out. And what the book allowed me to do was to go a little bit deeper.
All right. So when you were developing the screenplay, I'm still curious. Did you develop these characters over a long time, or was it the plot came to you and you needed to develop that? What did you spend the most time on?
I think it was plot originally. Yeah, I think it was plot. I think that the other stuff came later. I mean, there are character issues that really didn't develop until the novel.
Hmm.
But to me, it's always a matter of how can you add detail to enrich the story.
Well, I think that's right. And the book is richly detailed. And now that you say that you wrote it as a screenplay, it makes absolute sense to me. I know any number of authors who have taken their screenplays and turned them into books because they couldn't sell them as a movie.
Oh, is that right? Yeah,
Sure. And then I think that the question for me for you would be, are you going to try to now take the book and use it to try to sell the screenplay?
I hope so. That would be nice.
Well, that's frequently what it is. Sometimes the studios don't want anything that's original in a screenplay,
Yeah,
but if there's something that exists underneath it, i.e., a book,
yeah.
they'll suddenly get interested in the screenplay.
Yeah. And one of the conceits of my life as a fiction writer now is that I get to produce other stuff and publish other stuff. So I've always been told that the more you have to sell, the better your chances.
I think that's right. It is a business, I think, of amounts of material, not of just one thing.
Yes.
Though, if you're lucky, you hit one thing and that can carry you for a long time.
Yeah.
But certainly, volume is helpful
Yeah.
as a writer.
I have an inventory.
You have a war chest.
Yeah. I do.
Where did Dr. David Korda come from? Is this based on your dad?
Yes.
Based on your dad. Was your dad a doctor?
My father, well, to his everlasting frustration, he had been through medical school and he had been a labor camp prisoner and he had been a concentration camp prisoner. And after my parents were freed, they emigrated to the United States. And he couldn't get anybody in New York at the time to accept his credits. So he ended up becoming a physical therapist. But it was like a great frustration for him that he couldn't actually be a doctor.
What did he want to specialize in? Anything in particular?
I really don't know.
Interesting.
That never came up. Yeah.
Did you learn about his doctoring skills that you actually talk about in the book, certain how to suture and that kind of stuff? Did you learn that from him or did you learn that through research?
Just from research. Yeah.
Just from research.
Yeah.
And how much research did you do ultimately to tell this story in the first place?
Less than you would think. I wish
That's
I had
amazing.
done more. But, Google helped a lot. There was some research. I saw a lot of photographs that my parents had. There were pictures of them walking on Prague streets, and I always noted the cobblestones as, where they would walk. And I did look up to see what Prague was like so that I could describe those scenes. And this is a bit of unintentional research. A friend of mine, a commercial director named Brent Thomas, who unfortunately is no longer with us, went there to shoot. And I asked him what it was like. And he said it was like Dracula meets Disneyland. And that really helped me formulate stuff. I may have even used that line in the novel.
Did you take photographs off of the web or from books and put them around you so that you had them in plain sight as you were working?
I didn't. No,
You didn't. So you were using your imagination at all times.
that's right. Yeah.
Well, you say that you think you should have done more research or you could have done more research. What do you think you didn't do enough research on?
I don't know because I can't say that I'm happy with what I turned out.
Are you serious? It's really good.
So the screenplay went only so far as the plot is concerned. The book developed a whole other angle. I don't want to give anything away, but in the screenplay, he subdues his opponent.
Okay.
And in the novel, the opponent finds a way to continue pursuing him.
Hmm.
And so that's, another element of the deliverance.
I'm not going to give anything away, but
No.
it plays out to the very end.
Yes.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
Because you have a lot of stuff with Desdemona the horse. We talked about the horse a moment ago.
Yes.
Did you learn about horses from your mom, all about that? Or did you also do research on horses and that sort of stuff?
No, I invented most of it. I did do research on horses. That stuff about Desdemona being
Hmm.
an Olympian jumper and stuff like that.
Well, because you know a lot about the structure of horses from the book and how they walk and all the rest of it. That's all in there because of stuff that happens in the book that I don't want to give away.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of it was just, for me, it was logic.
Logic.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not exactly a horse person, so you may have gotten away with me telling me things that aren't correct.
yeah.
Have you had anybody read the book who is a horse person give you critiques?
I did. I did. And it got his approval.
Oh, well, that's good.
It shocked me. Yeah. And not that I was afraid of getting found out, but
So, what would you say were the biggest challenges in conceiving the story? What were the big hurdles you had to overcome?
just making it believable, making it something that people would identify with.
Hmm.
I think, like, the human element, how do you get people to follow this poor guy, who's, barely has anything to eat, who just has no resources, but is very resourceful.
Well, that's the key. You just hit it on the nose. It's that he's incredibly smart.
Yeah,
He's very clever and he's very resourceful, even though he has absolutely nothing to work with. He has no tools, he has no instruments, he has to
right.
figure it all out and find stuff and make it work. And that's what makes it really compelling, is because he's
Yes.
super
Yeah.
smart.
And that's what makes the challenge so challenging, that he has to face that stuff and figure a way forward.
I think that is exactly right. I'm glad that
Yeah.
you said it that way. How long did it take you to write the book? You already had a screenplay. So how long did it take you to develop the screenplay in the first place?
The screenplay, I think, came like within 6 months.
Okay.
I think it took me another year to write the novel.
And did you write the novel right away, or was there time between?
Yeah, right away. I
Right
did,
away.
because I refused to be defeated.
Because you already knew right away from the screenplay that it wasn't going to sell, at least not immediately.
Yeah, I was going to make this work somehow.
And you don't know yet whether it's circulating in Hollywood at this point.
I don't know. I don't think it is. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe.
I hope maybe you get it into the hands of someone like a Steven Spielberg, because he would be someone who, if he didn't do it himself, he would be somebody that might shepherd it.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's talk a moment about screenwriting, because obviously you did that for a while too. How old were you when you started writing screenplays?
I would say in my 30s.
In your 30s.
Yeah.
Obviously, advertising is what you did first,
Yeah.
really, as a career.
Yeah.
And then in your 30s, you get into screenwriting. You and I are both graduates of the UCLA screenwriting program, the MFA program there.
Yeah.
What do you think you learned at UCLA that you didn't know previously?
This is going to sound, I don't know, not very thoughtful, but theme, believe it or not.
I believe it.
It's a word that people don't understand. When I talked about rank, about giving the story that visual component, I think that was theme to me. And I think that sort of helped give a little bit of depth to the story.
We've already talked about Hal Ackerman, and one of the lessons I learned from Hal was, and he taught this very plainly, that he says when you start writing your story, don't think about theme, think about desire. What does the protagonist want?
Yes.
And develop your whole story. And when you're done, go back and look and figure out what the theme is, and then make sure that that's throughout the story.
Right.
Is that your approach as well?
That was my approach. I mean, because I had no idea about the theme when I started this. It was only when I started writing the novel, I started applying that.
Do you have a preference in terms of the way you sit down to write? Do you prefer to write screenplays? Do you prefer to write novels? What do you like better?
Right now, I'm just thinking about novels because there's only so much bandwidth.
Mhm.
And, maybe I have a bit of an audience as a novelist.
You very well might. What is it that separates screenwriting from novel writing? Is it that detail that you can get in depth?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
That's the main thing, isn't it?
You know, I don't have a whole lot of time for reading these days, reading fiction, but what I do is I listen to audiobooks, and there's something that it does to me as a listener that is that is so emotional that is the depth that I'm seeking. I was about to start writing my mother's story, my mother's Holocaust story, and I thought I need to know about other fiction with female protagonists. So I looked around and I kept on seeing this story called The Women by Kristen Hanna, and it's about combat nurses in Vietnam. And it was such a thrilling, emotional experience. I would be walking down the street sobbing because it reached me that way
As you were listening to it.
as I was listening.
So people probably thought you were crazy.
Absolutely.
This
I
guy's wandering down the streets crying.
yeah, I didn't care. I was having just a wonderful transcendent experience walking down the street.
Do you think that your years as an advertising copywriter and producer influenced the way that you look at stories and that allows you to feel that emotion?
Maybe superficially, I don't really see a strong connection to that. For me, advertising was an opportunity to tell jokes and to solve a marketing problem.
Mm-hmm.
You had to solve a marketing problem. But that was, really helpful. I mean, it just sort of made me more mature to learn that stuff.
Do you think that your ability to solve marketing problems helps you in the business end of selling books and screenplays?
Not really. Well, maybe a little bit. No, when I started marketing the uniform, I came up with some ads, and I had an ad for this book that I thought was, pretty strong, and the headline was "It explodes when you turn the page," and that was something that I couldn't have come up with if I hadn't, gone to work at Chiat Day, where they really emphasized the value of a good headline with depth and with wordplay.
I have a funny feeling you might have come up with it, but you wouldn't have known what to do with it.
Yes, that's right.
Because I think if somebody, a writer, thinks the way that you just thought with that headline, that explosive
Yeah,
headline, they might think to themselves, well, I can't tell anybody that
yeah,
because that's not my job. But you immediately think of it as here's a hook.
yeah,
And it is really all about hooks, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a great hook.
I had not done a lot of thrillers, so I didn't have reason to come up with explosive hooks. So this was a World War II story, and explosions were like a common part of it.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely a
Yeah.
big part of it. When you have a new story, do you usually outline or you just go?
So my screenplay for the uniform was my outline. I do a little bit of outlining now. Yes, I do. I think, one of the things in Paul Chitlick's class was he really taught you how to deliver a screenplay in a short amount of time. And his outlining technique was really valuable in that area.
So Paul Chitlick, for the listeners that are wondering who he is,
Yeah.
Paul Chitlick was a teacher when we were both at school at UCLA at different times. We weren't in school at the same time, but
Oh,
he was a teacher there that we both took class from. And Paul's been on this show twice, and he's maybe one of the finest screenwriting teachers I've ever known. And so you're getting top-notch advice and teaching from someone who really understands what that's all about.
oh, absolutely. I had never been able to write anything sooner than a year before I took a class with him. And all of a sudden I had a screenplay in 10 weeks.
Well, that's part of the game at UCLA is if you're
Yeah.
going to get a degree there, you got to write 4 of them in your time, and they're all within 10-week quarters. So you have to jump through hoops and make it happen.
Yeah.
It does give you good training, doesn't it, for marching your way through a task.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. Sort of Chitlick's technique was just so helpful in helping you develop a frame for a story that you can deliver within 10 weeks.
Well, and he's all about the outline.
Yes.
He'll take you through the first 6 weeks of 10 before you get to your screenplay, and then write the screenplay in the last 3 or 4 weeks.
That's right.
And it is very effective if you have a really good detailed outline. You can just go. You write your book off of the screenplay, which is already a developed story. So
Yeah.
you could just go. You didn't have to really, you might have added detail, but you didn't have to think too hard about the overall.
Right.
That's a grand way to go. Do you work with a certain audience in mind? Are you writing for an audience, or are you writing for yourself?
I'm writing for myself.
Mhm.
I think that may be a mistake, the way a lot of people think about the business.
I'm not so sure. I think
No?
if you have taste and you are a good audience member, if you think of yourself as you're in the pack of audience, that if you write for yourself, you're writing for others who are like you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm always approaching things from, is this entertaining? Is this thrilling? Is it funny? Is this engaging? And that's what I'm always going for.
Well, okay. So in the uniform, which I find fascinating, in this very bleak setting, very dire, life and death, and yet David Korda is filled with a sense of humor. He is very wry and he says all kinds of things to these people. I think it goes over their heads, but it doesn't go over the audience's head.
Uh-huh.
That was your intention, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, I don't know if I intended it to be a really wry story, but I think that's my approach to it.
Well, the story's not wry, but he
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, I enjoyed it every time he would say something that was like, wow, he's got balls
Yeah.
because he's saying this to these Nazis.
You know, they're in such bleak circumstances. And I think that kind of, I don't know if the word is deadpan, but the wryness comes out of the ironic brains of the people who go through it.
It also seems to me that this particular character probably knows he's close to being dead.
Yeah.
And so what has he got to lose? So he says what's on his head.
Oh, yes. Hadn't thought of it that way, but
I think that that's really great. Yeah, I mean, he has the freedom to say what he feels like
yeah.
because what's the difference? He doesn't care anymore. So when you're writing, do the scenes play out in your mind's eye before you write them?
I think so. I think so. I mean, well, I don't know. I've done it both ways. If you set out writing without knowing where you're going, you may go to an interesting place. But if you have an idea, a frame for a scene, then that comes from an understanding of that world. And it sort of pushes you into the conflict zone, you know? I mean, that's always what you want. The more difficult the circumstances, the better.
All right, so I think you are a very gifted writer of dialogue. That's part of what your training is. You obviously came up where you were writing radio ads and so on, and you're very gifted with words that communicate quickly through dialogue, which is a certain kind of writing. What do you think makes dialogue work? And what do you think writers should think about to avoid in dialogue writing?
I think one thing that immediately comes to mind is it has to be a reflection of the character who speaks it. And that gives you a direction that you can then complicate with conflict. You know what I mean? The dialogue is sort of like an expression of desire, I think. And by laying that out as a path to follow for the scene in a scene, you can then oppose it, you know, with a terrible opponent, a difficult opponent.
An adversary, an antagonist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Well, you've got to have it or there's no friction otherwise.
It's everything.
It is everything. I'm glad you say it that way. Are you a big rewriter?
Well, I guess I am because you know, I started out just doing simple screenplays, but I think that the novel business has forced me to sort of rethink everything and reconsider it.
In what way?
Well, I think I had mentioned that David overcomes his opponent at a certain point in the screenplay.
Yes.
You know, just to bring back the Firesign Theater. I used to talk to Phil Austin, a wonderful guy, wonderful guy.
So we're now talking about the Firesign Theater that we haven't talked
Yeah.
about in the show, but Gabby worked with Phil Proctor,
Yeah.
who's been on the show a couple times, and the Firesign Theater a long time ago. So that's what
Yeah.
we're now talking about.
And I knew that Phil Austin had written novels. And I said to him, you know, how do you take a 100-page novel and turn it into a 200-page book? And Phil Austin said to me, That's when you discover whether you have something to say or not. And I took that thought and I actually use it today. I just started editorializing. That was my takeaway from that. And it seems kind of superficial, but I think it's been the key to making my stories more interesting.
All right, for the listeners that don't know what you're talking about, what do you mean by editorializing?
So when you're writing a scene, you have the events, but like I say, you had to basically double the content to make a novel. And so editorializing is just me adding filigree to the events, my observations about the place and about the people. And I had the idea of a horse. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And then I thought I gave the horse some history, that the horse was a participant and a medal winner in Olympics. So there are always ways that you can sort of create complications to make a story more interesting.
I don't want to say it too detailed, but
Yeah.
you're putting meat on the bone
Yes, absolutely.
and you're filling things out where there is in a novel, you're getting this rich detail
Yeah.
that you actually have to get rid of in a screenplay.
Yeah, that's right.
You can't add that in the screenplay because the audience is only going to see it or hear it on the screen. They're not going to read it.
Yes. This is a story about people driven to extremes by anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
So anti-Semitism, it can be discussed, and I would say things about characters and about dealing with that. And what I do a few times is I discuss the subject and I pose questions about it within the narrative.
So, in order to get to the added dimensions, you're posing questions that you then answer.
Yes.
I think that that's a very good
Yeah.
way to do it. So, it is important that you ask questions in a novel because that's where the answers come from. You don't just feed the audience the answers, you have to think the questions up first.
I won't bet on it because I can't at the moment think of a question that I asked that I then answered.
Oh, I'm sure you had many.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I have long told people that one of the secrets to being a decent teacher is asking the right questions.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the thinking going on in the room.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
that's an art of itself. And you can ask the wrong questions in a class or in a book and come out with something that's not useful or valuable. So figuring that out is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Do you have any techniques or thoughts toward pitching?
No. No, I've never been very good at that. I mean, to me, the important part of the pitch is just having the log line, because I think that communicates so much that it engages the person that you're pitching.
That is a fact. Well, I have been having a really fabulous conversation for almost an hour with
Oh,
the great writer Gabby Gruen, and we're going to wind the show down just a little bit now. And I'm wondering, in all of your experiences, do you have a story that you can share with us that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny?
I wrote a comedy screenplay. It's called Hamlet versus Godzilla, and I brought it into Hal Ackerman's class when I was at UCLA.
Hal Ackerman, who's been on this show twice.
Yeah, yeah, and he said, "Did you just think of that on your way in? You didn't really think much of it." But I still, kind of love the story, to do the send up of Elizabethan dialogue and all of that stuff.
But in a horror setting.
Is it a horror setting? No.
Well, it's Godzilla.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I guess so. Quasi horror. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So you've already given us tons of advice throughout this whole show. But last question is, do you have a single solid piece of advice that you like to give to people who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit trying to get to the next level?
Well, I just think that the whole project, the business of trying to advance and getting turned down over and over again, getting feedback that is not that encouraging, is the best thing, because the wounds really not only toughen you up, but it matures you, because you end up asking you end up coming upon these questions, these dramatic questions, and figuring it out and learning how to figure things out. You grind, but if you do it for long enough, it pays off.
Well, that's really very wise advice. You can't gain any kind of knowledge without learning along the way, and that usually requires some failure
Yes.
and some things that don't work, and you have to figure out why didn't it work and how do I make it better.
Yes, absolutely.
And I have to assume that you have had your share of down a dead end road as you're writing. That didn't work. Okay, I'm going to cut that and we're going to do something different.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't necessarily me responding directly to that comment. It was just learning from it. You know,
Learning from it.
yeah, yeah,
Well, that's the way that you do learn, is
yeah,
by going into those places where either you're learning it on your own or somebody giving you feedback,
yeah,
like an audience is giving you feedback.
yeah.
And it's the only way to learn.
True.
I don't think otherwise you can.
Yeah.
George Bernard Shaw, who was a relatively decent writer but not a very good man, once famously said, "A man who makes no mistakes makes nothing at all."
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important concept, that you have to make mistakes and be willing to accept them and embrace them,
Yeah.
in fact.
In fact, the second part of that for me was that you have to get to the place where you're open enough to changing, where you're willing to take that kind of feedback and imbue your work with your wisdom.
Well, that's also a great piece of advice, is you have to be willing to be open,
Yes.
because there are legions of stories of writers who go in and they just refuse to listen to anybody's thoughts.
Absolutely.
And when that happens, nothing happens.
Yeah. I think I was guilty of that when I was younger.
Well, I think many people are, because it's precious to you what you're doing early on in life. And later on, you realize it's not quite as precious as you think, and
Yeah.
you're willing to let that go a little bit.
Yeah.
Don't you feel that for yourself at this point, that, if somebody came along and gave you a solid piece of notes on a book or something, you may not take all the notes, but you at least pay attention to them?
Absolutely. There's no question.
Yeah, I think that's the way you have to be. Gabby Gruen, this has been an absolutely wonderful hour on StoryBeat today, and I cannot thank you enough for your time, your energy, and your wisdom. And I hope that you continue to write and that people will go out and buy the uniform and read it.
Oh, thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.